Big Shaq walks into a mall, ready to buy shoes for kids in need, but then security steps in. They try to stop him, questioning his actions, but what happens next shocks the entire mall. A tense standoff, a viral moment, and an unexpected twist that changes everything. Because when kindness meets resistance, the whole world watches. When Big Shaq tries to buy shoes for kids in need, mall security steps in, but stopping him? That was their first mistake, a tense standoff, a viral outrage, a moment that would change everything. What started as a shopping trip became a battle for dignity, and the whole world was watching. Because sometimes, the biggest fights aren't fought in the ring, but in the heart. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The December air was sharp, biting through layers of winter coats and scarves as the holiday crowd bustled in and out of the Everbrook Mall. Strings of lights blinked against the gray sky. Store windows were dressed in holiday cheer, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts filled the air. Christmas was just around the corner, and the mall pulsed with energy. Families shopping for last-minute gifts, kids tugging their parents toward toy stores, and the steady hum of carols playing through overhead speakers. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to those who knew him, walked through the entrance, his towering frame naturally drawing attention. Heads turned, whispers followed, but Shaq hardly noticed. He had never been the type to bask in fame. Today, he was just another man enjoying the holiday season, walking through the familiar warmth of the mall, hands tucked in the pockets of his coat. But then he saw them. Just outside Blake's Footwear, a high-end sneaker store, a small group of kids stood huddled together, their noses practically pressed against the glass. Their eyes, wide with admiration, traced every inch of the sneakers on display, the ones with flashing lights, the limited editions, the high tops that promised speed and style. Yet none of them stepped inside. Their clothes were worn, their shoes scuffed and faded. One boy, Tyrell, barely 9 years old, wasn't even wearing shoes. His little feet were raw from the cold, barely protected by socks so thin they looked ready to tear. His hands, balled into fists, were shoved into the pockets of an oversized hoodie that swallowed his small frame. He shivered but didn't move away from the glass. Shaq's chest tightened. He had been that kid once, the one standing outside a store, wishing, hoping, knowing deep down that hope wouldn't be enough. He had seen that look before, the mix of admiration and quiet acceptance that some things just weren't meant for kids like them. Shaq didn't hesitate. "Hey, big man," he said, his deep voice gentle as he approached the boy. Tyrell flinched slightly, startled, before tilting his head up. His eyes widened as he recognized the towering figure before him. "You're..." His voice barely came out. Shaq grinned. "I'm just a guy who thinks you need some new kicks. Come on." The boy hesitated, looking back at the others. 3 more kids, all around the same age, bundled in layers that still weren't warm enough. A girl with curly hair, Lena, clutched Tyrell's sleeve. "We can't," she whispered. Shaq crouched, lowering himself to their eye level. "Why not?" Tyrell chewed on his lip. "We ain't got no money." Shaq chuckled, a warm, rolling sound. "Lucky for you, I do." The kids exchanged looks, unsure whether to believe it. Moments like these didn't happen in real life, not to them. But Shaq wasn't one to make empty promises. With a simple wave of his hand, he motioned them toward the door. "Come on," he said again, his voice light. "Pick whatever you want." Lena's eyes darted around, still filled with doubt, but when she saw Tyrell's face, pure, unfiltered excitement, she followed. The other 2 kids, Jace and Dayon, moved hesitantly behind them. As Shaq reached for the door handle, a voice cut through the moment. "Excuse me, sir." Shaq turned to find a man in a navy blue uniform standing nearby, arms crossed over his chest. His name tag read, Caldwell, a mall security guard. Shaq immediately recognized the expression on the man's face, caution wrapped in authority, the kind of look that had followed him his whole life. "Something wrong?" Shaq asked, keeping his tone even. Caldwell's gaze flickered to the kids, then back to Shaq. "We've had..." Some issues with loitering, just making sure everything's in order. Shaq exhaled through his nose, feeling a familiar heat rise in his chest. They're not loitering. They're shopping. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked down at Terrell's feet, at the worn-out socks, at the hesitant way the kid stood behind Shaq. His expression remained unreadable. "Is there a problem?" Shaq asked again, his voice carrying an edge now. The air between them grew tense. Around them, the festive buzz of the mall continued, unaware of the small storm brewing at the entrance of the sneaker store. Caldwell didn't move. His radio crackled at his hip, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he squared his shoulders. "Just making sure everything's under control." Shaq met his stare, unblinking. "It is." A long pause stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Finally, Caldwell exhaled, nodded once, and stepped aside. Shaq turned back to the kids, who had watched the exchange with careful eyes. He smiled again, warmth returning to his features. "Come on, let's get those shoes." The moment the doors swung open, the kids lit up. Inside, the store gleamed with bright displays, rows of sneakers lined up like treasures waiting to be claimed. Tyrell hesitated at first, his small hands brushing against a pair of sleek black high tops. Shaq nudged him gently. "Go ahead. Try 'em on one by one." The kids picked their shoes, some with blinking lights, others with bold colors. Tyrell slipped into the black high tops, bouncing on the balls of his feet, testing them out. His face broke into a grin so wide it could have powered the whole mall. The store manager, a middle-aged man with sharp glasses, approached cautiously. "Everything okay here?" Shaq flashed a smile. "Yeah, just making sure these kids have a good Christmas." The manager's gaze flicked toward the entrance, where Caldwell still stood. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. That's great. Let me know if you need anything." As Shaq paid for the shoes, he felt a tap on his arm. Terrell stood there, clutching the shoebox to his chest. His voice was small but clear. "Thank you." Shaq swallowed past the lump in his throat and ruffled the boy's hair. "Merry Christmas, little man." Outside, Caldwell was still watching. Shaq met his gaze once more, this time with a look that said more than words ever could. Caldwell looked away first. As Shaq walked the kids out of the store, he couldn't help but feel it. A shift, a small victory, a moment that mattered. And sometimes that was enough. Shaq walked with an easy, steady pace, leading the kids toward the entrance of Blake's footwear. He could feel their excitement buzzing beside him, the way Tyrell practically skipped despite the cold biting at his feet. Lena whispered something to Jace, who grinned, and even Dion, who had been the quietest of the group, was smiling now. For them, stepping into that sneaker store felt like stepping into another world, one where they weren't just watching from the outside. And for Shaq, this was the kind of moment he lived for, making someone's day better without expecting anything in return. But just as his hand reached for the door, a voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. "Sir, hold up a second." Shaq stopped, slowly turning his head toward the source of the voice. A man in a dark blue security uniform stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. The badge pinned to his shirt read, "Caldwell," and the way he stood, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared, made it clear that he wasn't here for a friendly chat. Two other security guards flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Shaq let his hand drop from the door handle, exhaling through his nose before speaking. "Something wrong?" Caldwell's eyes scanned the group, lingering on the kids, then flicking back to Shaq. "We've been getting complaints about loitering near the storefronts. You with them?" The question sent a flicker of irritation through Shaq's chest. He kept his expression neutral, but the weight of what Caldwell was implying settled heavy in the space between them. "They're with me," Shaq said evenly. Caldwell arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly are you doing?" Shaq resisted the urge to sigh. He had been in situations like this before, judged too quickly, questioned too harshly. He had learned a long time ago that his size, his presence, the color of his skin, all of it could turn a simple act into something people found suspicious. "I'm buying them shoes," Shaq replied, voice calm but firm. "That a problem?" Caldwell's posture didn't relax. Instead, he glanced at Tyrell's bare feet, at the way the kids stood close together, their small hands shoved into their pockets. He shifted slightly, as if debating something in his head. Mall policy says no unattended minors inside stores without a guardian, he finally said. If they don't have a parent or legal guardian with them, I can't let them in. The words hung in the air like an invisible barrier between Shaq and the entrance. Tyrell's smile faded. Lena gripped her sleeve, looking down at the ground. Jace and Dion exchanged nervous glances. The energy, the excitement that had been sparking between them just moments ago, dimmed under the weight of embarrassment. Shaq clenched his jaw. He knew that feeling all too well, the moment someone makes you feel small without even touching you. He wasn't about to let that happen. Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering presence making even Caldwell seem small. His voice, still calm, carried an edge now. I'm paying for their shoes. That makes me responsible for them, don't you think? Caldwell didn't step back, but his stance shifted slightly. His eyes flicked to the side as if checking for backup, but the other guards stayed silent. They weren't stepping in. Not yet. Around them, people were starting to notice. Shoppers slowed their steps, a few whispering to each other. Someone had their phone out, probably recording. The holiday buzz of the mall had shifted into something else entirely. Shaq saw it happening, the way the crowd's attention latched onto the scene. He wasn't trying to make this a spectacle, but he also wasn't about to let these kids be turned away like they didn't matter. Caldwell exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching at his side. Sir, I'm just following mall policy. Shaq nodded slowly. Right. And what exactly is the policy on a grown man spending his own money on a few pairs of sneakers for kids who need them? Silence. One of the security guards behind Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. The other glanced at the crowd, clearly aware that this situation was spiraling into something bigger than just mall policy. A woman nearby, pushing a stroller, frowned. That's Shaquille O'Neal, she whispered to someone beside her. What the hell is the problem? Shaq saw the hesitation flicker across Caldwell's face. It was subtle, but it was there, the realization that he was losing control of the situation. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. I can't let them in without a guardian, Caldwell repeated, but his voice wasn't as sharp this time. Shaq exhaled, then turned slightly, looking down at Tyrell, Lena, Jace, and Dion. The disappointment on their faces hit him harder than any confrontation ever could. Then, an idea struck. He turned back to Caldwell, his lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. You need a guardian, huh? He took a beat before adding, all right. Guess I'll be their guardian today. Caldwell blinked. That's not how... Do you really want to argue this? Shaq cut in smoothly. His voice was still steady, but there was a challenge behind it now. Because right now it looks like you're trying to stop me from helping some kids on Christmas. And judging by the way people are looking at you, he gestured subtly toward the growing crowd. I don't think that's going to go over too well. Caldwell's mouth opened, then closed. A long, tense moment passed. And then finally, Caldwell let out a short breath, stepping aside just a fraction of an inch. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Shaq nodded once and turned to the kids. Come on, he said, his voice light again, as if none of this had just happened. The moment the doors swung open, the kids hesitated for only a second before rushing inside. The excitement that had been stolen from them was back, crackling in the air like electricity. Shaq followed behind them, but before he stepped fully inside, he glanced over his shoulder at Caldwell one last time. Caldwell looked at him, jaw tight, expression unreadable. Shaq didn't need to say anything. The moment spoke for itself. Then, without another word, he stepped into the store, letting the door close behind him. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that made people stop mid-step, their conversations fading into whispers. The mall, which had been alive with the buzz of holiday shopping, now had a single focal point. The towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal, standing firm against the unwavering stance of Mall Security Chief Caldwell. The kids had already taken a few steps toward the store, excitement flickering in their eyes, but Caldwell's sharp voice pulled them back. I told you, Caldwell said, stepping back in front of the entrance, arms crossed over his chest. I can't let you take these kids inside. Shaq's brows pulled together. "And I told you," he said, voice calm but edged with irritation. "I'm buying them shoes, that's all." Caldwell didn't budge. "We have rules." Shaq let out a slow breath, measuring his response. He had dealt with this too many times before. People who took one look at him and assumed trouble. It didn't matter that he was one of the most recognizable figures in the country. To people like Caldwell, all they saw was a giant black man breaking the status quo. The kids shifted uncomfortably. Lena clutched Tyrell's arm, as if she could physically pull him away from the embarrassment curling at his shoulders. Jace stared at his shoes, scuffing them against the tile. Dayon glanced between Shaq and Caldwell, confusion knitting his brows. Shaq saw the way their confidence had shrunk, the way their excitement had been replaced with shame, and it took him back to being a kid in Newark. The memory came sharp and fast. He was 12 years old, already towering over the other kids in his neighborhood. He had wanted a new pair of sneakers so bad, but money had been tight. One day, he had wandered into a shoe store just to look. He hadn't even touched anything, just stood by the display, staring at the latest Jordans, wishing he had the kind of feet that could step into something that special. But the second the clerk saw him, a tall black kid in an oversized hoodie, the man had come over and stood right beside him, arms folded, making it clear he was being watched. Shaq had left without a word. He had told his mom about it later, and Lucille O'Neal, the strongest woman he had ever known, had cupped his face in her hands and said, "Baby, people are going to judge you before they even know you. You just make sure you show them who you really are." That moment had never left him. And looking at Tyrell now, at the way the little boy was curling inward, trying to disappear, Shaq realized he was watching the same thing happen all over again. And he wasn't about to let that happen. Shaq straightened, rolling his shoulders back. He was twice Caldwell's size, and if he wanted to, he could have walked straight through the entrance and no one could have stopped him. But that wasn't the fight. He wasn't here to intimidate. He was here to prove a point. Before he could speak, a voice from the crowd broke through the tension. "That's Shaquille O'Neal!" Heads turned. A woman with a toddler on her hip stood near a Starbucks, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh my God! Are you serious?" she said, looking straight at Caldwell. "You're stopping Shaquille O'Neal from buying kids some shoes?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Recognition spread like wildfire. "That's really him? What the hell is this about?" Shaq could feel the shift immediately. The mall was filled with people who knew who he was, and if there was one thing America loved, it was a hero being wronged. Caldwell's stance didn't falter, but Shaq saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes now. "I don't care who he is," Caldwell said, voice louder now, like he was trying to reassert control over the moment. "Mall policy is mall policy." Shaq turned, addressing everyone now, not just Caldwell. "I don't want anything for free," he said, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "I'm not making a scene. I'm just trying to buy these kids some shoes because it's Christmas, and no kid should be standing outside in the cold staring at something they can't have." The words hung in the air. A few people nodded in agreement. Others pulled out their phones. Someone started recording. Caldwell felt it now. The shift. The power was no longer in his hands. And yet, he still wouldn't move. "This isn't a charity," he said, his jaw tightening. "If the kids don't have parents with them, I can't allow them inside." Shaq felt his patience stretching thin. He looked down at Tyrell, at the way his tiny hands were curled into fists inside his hoodie sleeves, at the way his shoulders had sunk, as if expecting rejection. Then he looked back at Caldwell. "Then I guess you're saying these kids don't deserve to be here," Shaq said, his voice low now. Caldwell hesitated. Shaq had put him in a position he didn't expect. If he said yes, he'd sound like a man who thought poor kids didn't belong in his mall. If he said no, he'd have to back down. The silence stretched long. Shaq let it sit there, watching, waiting. And then, finally, Caldwell exhaled sharply, his jaw twitching as he stepped slightly to the side. "Fine," he muttered. "But you take responsibility for them." Shaq smiled, slow and knowing. He had already been responsible for them. He turned to the kids, his tone light again, like none of this had just happened. "You heard him," he said, grinning. "Let's get those shoes." The moment they stepped inside, Terrell's whole face lit up again. And for Shaq, that was all that mattered. The air inside the mall had changed. It was no longer just a holiday shopping scene. It was something more, something tense, charged, unpredictable. The confrontation between Big Shaq and Caldwell had drawn more than just a few curious onlookers. People had stopped in their tracks, whispering, recording. Phones were out, fingers typing furiously, some already live-streaming the standoff. This wasn't just a small misunderstanding anymore, and Shaq could feel it. But Caldwell? He still wouldn't back down. "Sir," Caldwell said, voice clipped, "I already explained the policy. If these kids don't have a parent or guardian present, I can't let them in." Shaq exhaled through his nose, his patience stretched thin but still intact. He wasn't here to argue about rules. He was here for 4 kids who had already suffered enough rejection in their lives. And then, a voice Shaq hadn't heard before cut through the tension. "Caldwell," a man muttered, stepping up beside him. Officer Grady, another mall security guard, shorter and stockier, with thinning hair and a wary look in his eyes. He leaned in toward Caldwell, whispering something under his breath. Shaq caught bits and pieces. "That's Shaquille O'Neal. Not just some guy off the street. You sure you want to do this?" Caldwell's expression flickered, just for a second. A small crack in his unwavering stance. He shifted on his feet, glancing around at the growing crowd, at the phones pointed in their direction. Shaq saw it. But Caldwell was a man who had already drawn a line in the sand. And stepping back now? That would mean admitting he had been wrong. So instead, he squared his shoulders again. "Doesn't change anything," he said. "Rules are rules." Shaq ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He wasn't about to lose his cool over this, but damn, this was testing him. He gestured toward the store. "So, you're telling me I can't spend my own money to help these kids?" Caldwell didn't answer. He didn't need to. The crowd had heard the question, and they were already forming their own opinions. On the edge of the crowd, a young man adjusted the lens on his camera. Elliot Wade, a local journalist, had been covering a lighthearted holiday shopping piece when he stumbled upon this scene. And now, he had a real story. His camera was already rolling. His phone was out, broadcasting live. "We are here at Everbrook Mall, where security is currently stopping NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal from buying shoes for a group of underprivileged kids," he said, voice crisp and steady. What should have been a simple act of kindness is now turning into a controversy about mall policies and, as some are speculating, racial bias. That last phrase made a few people shift uncomfortably. Shaq wasn't blind to what was happening. He knew how this looked. A massive black man standing off with mall security, while 4 black kids stood helplessly beside him. It didn't matter how rich or famous he was, the optics were undeniable. And the internet? It wasn't going to stay quiet. Elliot's livestream was already picking up speed. Comments started flooding in. "Are you kidding me? They're stopping Shaq? This is why people don't trust authority. Guys trying to help. Racism alive and well, folks. Somebody better fix this fast." And then came the retweets, the reposts, the headlines. Within minutes, the story had gone from a minor incident in a shopping mall to something much, much bigger. Shaq saw Elliot filming, saw people typing on their phones, saw Caldwell's posture stiffen as he realized he was now the villain of a very public narrative. Caldwell felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. For the first time, he looked unsure. Shaq folded his arms, watching the man wrestle with his own pride. And then, the moment of reckoning arrived. The Everbrook Mall was no longer just a shopping center filled with holiday cheer. It had become the center of a national controversy. By the time Caldwell realized how badly the situation had spiraled out of control, it was already too late. Social media was on fire. The live stream by journalist Elliot Wade had racked up thousands of views within minutes. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok exploded with outrage as clips of Shaq's calm but firm confrontation with security spread like wildfire. Mall security is stopping Shaq from buying shoes for poor kids. Let that sink in. A black man trying to do something good, and they still find a way to block him. Disgusting. Shaquille O'Neal is one of the kindest guys out there, and they're treating him like a criminal. What is wrong with people? Celebrities started chiming in. Athletes, actors, activists, everyone had an opinion. Some called for a boycott of the mall, others demanded an official apology. And then came the corporate damage control. Miles away, in a high-rise office overlooking downtown Atlanta, a man in a tailored suit was not happy. Mr. Hastings, the owner of Everbrook Mall, had just gotten off the phone with his corporate PR team, who had made it painfully clear that if he didn't fix this mess immediately, the mall's name would be dragged through the mud indefinitely. His assistant had Twitter pulled up on her iPad, scrolling through the backlash. Hastings rubbed his temple as he watched a video of Shaq kneeling beside a little boy who was now crying. He felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just bad optics. This was a disaster. Back at the mall, the weight of everything had finally caught up to Terrell. He had been holding it in, trying to be strong like he always had to be. But standing there, in front of all those people, feeling like he had done something wrong just for wanting a pair of shoes, it was too much. A single tear slipped down his cheek, then another. And before he could stop it, he was crying. The sound was soft at first, but Shaq noticed immediately. Without hesitation, he knelt beside the little boy, his massive frame folding down with practiced ease. "Hey, hey," Shaq murmured, his voice soft, steady. "What's this about, little man?" Tyrell sniffled, wiping at his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. I just," he hiccuped. "I didn't mean to cause no trouble." Shaq's chest tightened. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "Not one thing." Tyrell's lower lip trembled. "But now they mad at you, and it's my fault." Shaq shook his head. "No, it's not. Sometimes grown folks don't see what's right in front of them, and that ain't on you." The boy blinked up at him. "But I just wanted shoes." "I know," Shaq said, "and you're gonna get 'em. I promise." As Shaq comforted Tyrell, the situation around them escalated. More reporters had arrived on the scene, their cameras flashing, microphones being shoved forward. "Shaq, how do you feel about the mall refusing service? Do you think race played a role in this? What do you have to say to Everbrook Mall's management?" Shaq ignored them all, focused solely on Tyrell, on making sure the boy understood that none of this was his fault. But Caldwell? He wasn't handling the media storm nearly as well. He had gone from looking authoritative to uncomfortable, shifting on his feet as the questions began turning toward him. "Sir, why did you block Shaquille O'Neal from entering the store? Do you regret your decision now that this has gone viral?" Caldwell opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked toward the entrance, like he was hoping for backup. That's when Mr. Hastings arrived. The tension in Everbrook Mall had reached its peak. The cameras flashed, reporters threw questions into the thick air, and the crowd grew larger by the second. Security Chief Caldwell stood firm, arms crossed, jaw locked, refusing to acknowledge the shift happening around him. But Shaq? He wasn't here to argue anymore. He slowly rose to his full height, his broad shoulders stretching beneath his coat as he looked around, not just at Caldwell, but at everyone watching. The shoppers, the store employees, the other mall security guards, the reporters, the families, all of them waiting to see how this played out. And that's when Shaq realized something. This wasn't about shoes anymore. It wasn't even about Tyrell or the other kids standing beside him. It was about something bigger. It was about how people saw each other. About how easy it was to judge before knowing the full story. And that was something Shaq couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, then spoke, not to Caldwell, not to the reporters, but to the entire mall. "You know, when I was a kid, I didn't have much either," he said, his deep voice carrying through the air, quieting the murmurs, commanding attention. "I grew up in Newark. We struggled. My mom did everything she could for us, but some days, it wasn't enough." The crowd leaned in. Even some of the security guards, previously standing at attention, stiff and indifferent, shifted uncomfortably. "There was this one time," Shaq continued, his eyes distant as the memory surfaced. "I wanted a new pair of sneakers so bad, the kind all the cool kids had. I wasn't asking for $100 pair or anything crazy. I just wanted something that wasn't falling apart." He let out a small breath, shaking his head. "But we couldn't afford them. So I went to a store, just to look, just to feel like maybe someday I could have something nice. And you know what happened? A few people in the crowd whispered. They already knew where this was going. The guy working there, he watched me like I was going to steal something, Shaq said. Like I didn't belong. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I wasn't doing anything wrong, Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. But that's how people saw me. A kid too big, too black, too poor. And I'll never forget that feeling. That feeling of being looked at like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I didn't deserve something as simple as a pair of shoes. He paused, letting the words sink in. Now I look at Tyrell, he said, glancing down at the boy still gripping his shoebox. And I see that same look in his eyes, that same hurt, that same question. Am I not good enough? The crowd was dead silent now. A few of the security guards shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a younger officer standing near Caldwell, had his arms crossed at first. But now, his hands had dropped to his sides. He looked away, almost ashamed. Shaq turned his gaze back to Caldwell. And now I gotta ask you, he said. Is that what we're doing here? Are we telling these kids they don't deserve to walk into a store? That they don't belong? Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Shaq let the question hang there for a long moment before continuing. I get that rules exist for a reason, he said. But there's a difference between following rules and forgetting common sense, forgetting kindness, forgetting that sometimes the right thing to do isn't always in a rule book. The younger security guard, the one who had looked away earlier, cleared his throat. His name tag read, Officer Decker. He's right, Decker muttered. Caldwell's head snapped toward him. Excuse me? Decker lifted his chin, looking uncomfortable but firm. I said, he's right. Shaq didn't break eye contact with Caldwell. He could see it now, the tiniest crack in the man's stance. But still, Caldwell refused to move. Rules are rules, Caldwell repeated, his voice clipped. But there was less force behind it now. Shaq studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. Man, I feel sorry for you, he said, his voice low but full of meaning. Caldwell's eyes flashed, but Shaq wasn't done. Not because of this, Shaq said, gesturing to the store. But because one day, you're gonna look back at this moment and realize you were the guy who stood in the way of something good. Caldwell's fingers twitched at his sides, but for the first time, he had nothing to say. And that was more powerful than any argument Shaq could have won. The air inside Everbrook Mall was thick with tension, every eye locked onto the unfolding drama. Shaq's words still lingered, pressing into the silence like a weight no one could shake off. Caldwell stood stiff, his face unreadable, but everyone could see the crack in his authority. His once solid grip on the situation was slipping. Then, something no one expected happened. From beyond the growing crowd, the steady click of expensive leather shoes echoed through the marble floors. The crowd instinctively parted, their murmurs shifting into whispers. The presence of the newcomer was impossible to ignore. A tall, well-dressed man in a sharp navy suit, silver cufflinks gleaming under the mall's fluorescent lights. He walked with purpose, his expression unreadable, but unmistakably authoritative. And Shaq recognized him immediately. Mr. William Hastings, the owner of Everbrook Mall himself. Caldwell stiffened the moment he saw him, his already rigid posture turning to stone. Shaq didn't move, watching as Hastings strode toward them, his sharp eyes scanning the situation like a CEO evaluating a disaster in real time. He was an older man, his neatly combed silver hair adding to his air of authority. But there was no arrogance in his stance, just cold calculation, the look of a businessman measuring damage control. When Hastings finally came to a stop, he didn't address Caldwell. He didn't acknowledge the reporters. He didn't look at the crowd. Instead, he turned to Shaq. And in front of everyone, on live streams, in front of cameras, in front of security guards and employees and stunned shoppers, he extended his hand. Shaquille, Hastings said, his voice smooth, professional but unmistakably sincere. I owe you an apology. A wave of shock moved through the crowd. Caldwell flinched, his mouth opened but nothing came out. Shaq, still holding Tyrell's shoulder in reassurance, slowly stood straighter. He looked at Hastings for a long moment, then finally clasped his hand, giving it a firm shake. "Mr. Hastings," Shaq said, voice steady. Hastings glanced at the kids, at Tyrell's bare feet, at Lena's wary stance, at Jace and Dion still watching anxiously from the side, before shifting his gaze to Shaq. "I watched the footage," Hastings said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I saw how this played out, and I'll be honest with you, I'm embarrassed." The crowd stirred. People exchanged glances, some whispering, others still stunned into silence. Shaq didn't respond, letting the man continue. "I built this mall to be a place for the community," Hastings said. "A place where families could come together, where no one was made to feel like they didn't belong." His jaw tightened, and his next words carried a quiet anger. That vision was not reflected here today. For the first time, Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, and Hastings finally turned to him. "I've been in business long enough to know when an employee has made a mistake," Hastings said, his tone colder now. "And I know when that mistake is a reflection of something deeper." Caldwell bristled, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Sir, I was just following mall policy." Hastings cut him off with a single look. "No, Caldwell," he said, his voice firm. "What you were doing was making a decision based on assumptions, based on bias. And you did it in front of cameras, in front of families, in front of one of the most respected athletes and philanthropists in the country." Caldwell's face flushed. "This isn't just bad PR," Hastings continued. "It's bad business, and I don't run my business this way." A beat of silence. Then Hastings dropped the hammer. "You're fired." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The tension snapped like a rubber band, replaced by a murmur of disbelief, then a wave of satisfaction. Some people even cheered. Caldwell looked stunned. He blinked, his mouth opening as if he couldn't quite process the words. "Sir, please, Hastings didn't let him finish. "Collect your things," he said simply. "Security will escort you out." And just like that, the man who had tried so hard to assert control had lost it all in an instant. Caldwell's face was flushed red with humiliation, but he knew better than to argue further. With stiff movements, he turned and began walking away, his steps quick, his pride shattered beyond repair. As he disappeared into the crowd, a wave of energy surged through the mall. People were cheering now, full-on clapping. A few had their phones up, still recording, capturing the exact moment justice was served. But Hastings wasn't done. He turned back to Shaq, exhaling as if shedding the weight of the mess he had just cleaned up. "I can't undo what happened today," he said, "but I can make sure something good comes out of it." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Hastings nodded. "Starting now, Everbrook Mall is launching a citywide charity initiative, a partnership between the mall, local businesses, and Shaquille O'Neal's foundation." He looked at Shaq. "If you'll have us." Shaq grinned, the weight in his chest finally lifting. "That depends," he said. "Are we talking about a little PR stunt, or are you serious?" Hastings didn't hesitate. "Serious." Shaq studied him for a beat, then nodded. "All right, then let's do it." The crowd erupted into applause. Even the kids were grinning now, their earlier fear and embarrassment completely washed away. Tyrell tugged on Shaq's sleeve, his voice small but hopeful. "Does this mean we can get our shoes now?" Shaq laughed, a deep, genuine sound, and finally turned toward the store entrance. "You better believe it, little man," he said. And this time, when Shaq led them into the store, no one stopped him. The moment Shaq stepped into Blake's footwear, the weight that had been pressing on his chest finally lifted. This time, no one stopped him. No security guards blocking the door. No questions, no hesitation. Just the soft chime of the store's bell as he led Terrell, Lena, Jace, and Dayon inside. The kids hesitated for a split second, as if still expecting someone to tell them they didn't belong. But when no one did, when the warmth of the store wrapped around them, when the rows of sneakers stretched out before them like a kingdom of possibilities, the fear melted away. Tyrell's eyes widened as he took in the walls lined with brand new shoes, some sleek and stylish, others bold and bright. His fingers twitched at his sides like he didn't know where to start. Shaq chuckled. Well, he said, nudging him gently. What are you waiting for, little man? Pick whatever you want. Terrell glanced up at him, still uncertain, but then Lena grabbed his hand, pulling him forward. Come on, she said, excitement finally creeping into her voice. And just like that, the four of them scattered, running from shelf to shelf, eyes dancing with possibilities. Shaq stood back, watching them with a quiet smile. He had been in hundreds of stores like this, bought more shoes than he could count. But this time was different. This wasn't about sneakers. It was about dignity, about letting these kids feel like they mattered, about showing them that the world wasn't just a place that shut doors in their faces. A soft voice beside him broke through his thoughts. Excuse me, sir? Shaq turned to find a thin woman standing nearby, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. Tyrell's mother. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. Her coat was too thin for the weather outside, her shoes scuffed and barely holding together. But her eyes were warm, filled with a quiet strength that Shaq recognized. He had seen it before, in his own mother's eyes. Shaq offered a kind smile. You must be Terrell's mom. She nodded quickly. Yes, sir. My name's Danielle. Her voice was soft, uncertain. I just wanted to say thank you. She swallowed hard, blinking fast like she was trying to hold back tears. You didn't have to do this, but you did. And I don't even have the words to tell you what it means. Shaq looked back toward Tyrell, who was currently admiring himself in a mirror, testing out a pair of sleek black high tops. His smile was so wide it could have lit up the whole mall. Shaq turned back to Danielle. How long's he been needing new shoes? She hesitated, as if embarrassed to admit it. A while, she said finally. I haven't been able to afford them. Shaq could hear the shame in her voice. That quiet, unspoken pain that came with trying your best, but still falling short. He nodded. You work? She nodded quickly. 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and waitressing during the day. She let out a small, tired laugh. Still ain't enough sometimes. Shaq's chest tightened. He knew what that life looked like. Had lived it. He glanced back at Terrell. Smart kid? Her face lit up. Oh yes, he's real smart. Loves to read, wants to be an engineer someday. Her voice cracked a little on the last part, like she wasn't sure if someday was even possible. Shaq met her gaze, his own voice steady, certain. He's gonna get there. Danielle let out a small, shaky laugh. I hope so. Shaq shook his head. Nah, he will. I'll make sure of it. She frowned, confused. What do you mean? Shaq pulled out his wallet, flipping through until he found what he was looking for. He held out a sleek black business card. My foundation, he said simply. We do scholarships, mentorship programs, help kids like Tyrell get to where they want to be. Danielle's hand trembled as she took the card. Her eyes darted between it and Shaq, as if struggling to believe this was real. I ain't just here to buy shoes, Shaq said, voice gentle but firm. I'm here to make sure your boy never has to stand outside a store window wishing for something again. Danielle's face crumpled. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, her shoulders shaking as she let out a quiet sob. She covered her mouth with one hand, clutching the card with the other like it was the most valuable thing she had ever held. Shaq didn't say anything. He just reached out, pulling her into a warm, steady hug. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. Thank you, thank you, thank you. As Danielle wiped her tears, something started happening. The people in the store, the customers, the employees, even the ones who had just been watching from a distance, started stepping forward. A man in a flannel jacket approached Shaq, pulling a $100 bill from his wallet. Hey, put this toward whatever else these kids need. A woman holding a shopping bag nudged her daughter, who handed over a brand new pair of gloves and a scarf. For the little guy, she said with a smile. Another customer, a teenage boy in a puffer jacket, placed a pair of socks on the counter. Figured he could use these too. One by one, more and more people started contributing. It was like a switch had been flipped, as if seeing one act of kindness had made them all realize they had the power to do the same. The store manager, a man who had been watching the whole situation with hesitant eyes, stepped forward next. Shaq, he said, voice a little gruff. This one's on us. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Come again? The manager cleared his throat, then nodded toward the register. The shoes, all of them. We'll cover it. A fresh wave of cheers erupted in the store. Shaq grinned. That so? The manager shrugged, but there was a quiet emotion in his eyes now. Something deeper than just a business move. Figure it's the least we can do. Shaq clapped him on the back, giving a nod of approval. Good man. Tyrell, still lacing up his new sneakers, suddenly looked up. Wait, so I get to keep these? Shaq laughed, crouching down to ruffle the kid's hair. You get to keep those, little man. Tyrell looked like he was about to explode from happiness. He threw his arms around Shaq's waist, hugging him tight. Thank you, Shaq. Shaq's throat tightened, but he just smiled, hugging him back. Merry Christmas, kid. By the time they left the store, the energy in the mall was different. The people who had witnessed everything weren't just talking about what happened. They were feeling it. A lesson had been learned that day, something that went beyond just shoes, beyond rules, beyond policies. It was about kindness. It was about respect. It was about how one act of good could spread further than anyone ever imagined. Shaq looked down at Tyrell, who was still bouncing happily in his new sneakers, and smiled. Sometimes, the best gifts weren't the ones you bought. They were the ones you gave from the heart. A week had passed since the moment that had changed Everbrook Mall forever. What started as one act of kindness had spread like wildfire, reaching far beyond the sneaker store, beyond the mall, beyond the city. It had become a movement. Now, the same place that had once been the center of controversy was buzzing with something entirely different. Hope. The entrance of Everbrook Mall was transformed. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, each one bearing the same bold message. The big give back. No kid left behind. A giant stage had been set up in the center of the mall, where tables overflowed with brand new shoes, winter coats, backpacks, and school supplies. This wasn't just an event. It was a statement. A commitment that no child in this community would be forgotten, ignored, or turned away again. At the front of the stage, Shaq stood tall, surrounded by volunteers, store owners, and families who had come together to make this moment possible. And in the middle of it all, Tyrell, the little boy who had once stood outside the sneaker store, staring at something he thought he could never have, now stood in the front row. But this time, he wasn't just a spectator. He was part of something bigger. As families lined up, each child was fitted for a new pair of sneakers. Not just any sneakers, but ones they picked for themselves. No one had to explain why they were there. No one had to feel ashamed for needing help, and that was the real gift. Shaq watched as Tyrell, now proudly wearing his black high tops, helped another little boy try on a pair of red sneakers. Try walking in 'em, Tyrell said, grinning. They gotta feel just right. The little boy beamed, taking a few small steps before nodding. They feel perfect. Shaq felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was the impact he had hoped for. Not just handing out shoes, but handing out dignity. The event had drawn in more than just families in need. Local business owners had stepped up, donating supplies and offering resources. The sneaker store that had originally hesitated? Now, they were sponsors. The mall, once criticized for its treatment of Shaq and the kids? Now, it was the host of something that would happen every year. Even employees who had witnessed the confrontation that day had signed up to help, handing out coats, guiding kids to different sections, making sure no child left empty-handed. Shaq had always believed in the power of giving back, but seeing it unfold like this? It was bigger than he had ever imagined. Not far from the event, sitting inside a quiet diner across the street, a man watched the news coverage play on a small TV mounted in the corner. Caldwell. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. His plate of food barely touched. He had seen the footage of himself online more times than he cared to count. The moment he refused to let Shaq into the store, the backlash, the firing. But this, seeing what had come out of it, seeing the mall that had once been his territory now standing for something he hadn't believed in, it was hard to swallow. He looked down at his hands, fingers twitching. He had spent so long enforcing rules, believing he was doing the right thing. But had he been? He thought about the kids that day, the way they had shrunk back when he spoke, the way Tyrell had looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse. Hurt. Caldwell let out a breath, running a hand down his face. For the first time since everything had happened, he wasn't just angry about losing his job. He was wondering if he had deserved it. Back at the event, Shaq stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted. Every camera turned toward him. Reporters held up microphones. And Shaq, never one for long speeches, said something that would be remembered long after the event was over. "You never know what someone's going through," he said, his deep voice carrying through the mall. His gaze moved over the families, the volunteers, the kids who were now running, playing, smiling, free from worry, even if just for today. But kindness? He nodded, his expression serious. That changes everything. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Shaq wasn't looking at the cameras anymore. He was watching Tyrell, Lena, Jace, and Dion, kids who, just a week ago, had felt invisible. Kids who now believed in something bigger than themselves. And as they ran through the mall in their brand new sneakers, laughing and racing each other down the hallways, Shaq smiled, because he knew this was just the beginning. Kindness isn't just a moment, it's a movement. Be the reason someone gets a chance, a smile, a second shot. Look around. Who needs a door opened, a hand extended? The smallest act can create the biggest ripple. What will yours be?